One tree can produce over 1 million calories per year. Entire civilizations have survived on this food source for thousands of years. Why has modern society completely forgotten about this? We replant our gardens every year, wasting our energy on an endless cycle. And trees have been quietly outproducing farms for decades. Food crises are becoming inevitable in a changing climate. Only those who plant now will benefit in 10 years. 8 specific trees can replace entire garden plots. One of them produces chocolate-flavored fruits and never spoils. It's time to rethink what real food security means. Annual crops are work. Every spring you plant, every fall you harvest, every year you start from scratch. You trade labor for food in a 12-month cycle that never ends. Trees are built differently. You plant a tree once, wait, and then it feeds you for decades, sometimes generations. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations confirms that small-scale annual farming requires 60% more labor hours per calorie produced compared to perennial systems. Imagine a farmer trapped in endless seasonal cycles. March, soil preparation; April, sowing; May, weeding; June, watering; July, pest control; August, more watering; September, harvesting; October, harvesting; November, preparation for winter. And in February, everything starts anew, as if the previous year did not exist. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby grows an old walnut tree that his grandfather planted 50 years ago. Every autumn, it drops 40 kilograms of nuts without any human intervention. No one waters it, fertilizes it, or sprays it against pests. There are 8 trees that will produce more food in their lifetime than you can grow in an equivalent area of annual beds. These are not ornamental plants, they are food production systems that your great-grandchildren will harvest from. Permaculture researchers Bill Mollison and David Holmgren formalized the concept of perennial food systems in the 1970s, demonstrating their superiority to traditional farming. Their calculations revealed a startling truth. A single mature oak tree can produce enough calories to feed an adult for an entire year. Number 5 on our list produces between 200 and 400 kilograms of chocolate-flavored pods annually. These pods last for years without being processed and survive droughts that kill everything else. Moreover, the tree itself requires virtually no maintenance after rooting. Number 1 is able to feed a family of 4 solely from the fruits of one tree. It was this source of food that was the basis of nutrition for entire civilizations for thousands of years, until modern society forgot about its existence. Medieval European estates legally passed on gardens as ancestral assets, recognizing their value as greater than the value of the land. 14th-century English estate archives record that walnut and chestnut groves were valued above arable fields because they produced food without labor. An apple tree planted in 1722 still grows in Kent. Every autumn, it produces a harvest of apples, which are collected by the descendants of the man who planted it 300 years ago. This tree has survived wars, droughts, economic crises, and 12 generations of estate owners. When you plant a tree today, you are creating a system that will work regardless of your presence. In 20 years, it will begin serious production. In 50 years, it will reach peak fruiting. In 100 years, it will still feed your descendants. Imagine the timescale of this decision. Your great-grandchildren will be picking nuts from the tree you plant next week. They won't even know your name, but they will eat the fruits of your forward-thinking planning. The mulberry is a forgotten fruit that feeds itself. Stores don't sell mulberries because the berries are too delicate to transport. They crease if you look at them incorrectly. This means that most people have never tried mulberry and have no idea what they are missing out on. Mulberry trees are incredibly productive. A mature tree can produce from 25 to 40 kilograms of fruit per year. Research from the University of California shows that the Morris Alba variety, under optimal conditions, exceeds yields of 50 kilograms per tree. The fruits ripen gradually over several weeks, which means there is no avalanche of harvest all at once. The berries are sweet, nutritious, and do not require processing. Pick them and eat them. But the main advantage of the mulberry as a survival tree is that it requires zero maintenance. You plant a tree and then ignore it. No pruning required, no pest control required, no fertilizer required. Mulberries tolerate poor soils, drought, and neglect, and simply grow and bear fruit regardless of your input. Mulberries supported the economy of the Silk Road from 2700 BC in China. Entire villages depended on mulberry trees for both food and silk, as the leaves fed the silkworms. Archaeological finds confirm that people relied on these trees long before the advent of agriculture. In some parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, dried mulberries are still a staple food stored for winter consumption. The fruits contain approximately 10% protein when dried, which is exclusive to fruits. This figure exceeds the protein value of most cereals. The trees grow quickly. A mulberry planted as a seedling will begin to bear fruit in 3 to 5 years. This is fast for a fruit tree, especially compared to apple trees, which take 6 to 10 years to produce significant production. Fresh mulberries can be eaten, dried for storage, made into jam, fermented into wine, or frozen. The leaves are edible and nutritious. This is what silkworms feed on, which gives an idea of their nutritional value. One tree solves the food problem for the next 50 years. Most fruit trees produce food that is high in sugar and water, but low in calories and fat. Hazelnuts are radically different. They are calorie-dense, approximately 2,800 calories per kilogram, high in healthy fats and protein. This is critical for survival. Sugar feels good, but calories and fat keep you alive. A mature walnut tree produces 10 to 15 kilograms of nuts per year, which equates to 28,000 to 42,000 calories per tree. Hazelnuts can be stored for more than a year in their shells without refrigeration. It's a shelf-stable, nutritionally dense food that you grow once and harvest annually for decades. USDA research confirms high levels of monounsaturated fats, which are critical for cardiovascular health. Hazelnuts grow in temperate climates and tolerate a variety of soil conditions. The trees begin bearing fruit 3 to 4 years after planting and are relatively resistant to pests compared to other nut crops. During the Irish famine, wild nuts supplemented the diet when staple crops died. Archaeological finds from Mesolithic sites in Scotland dating back to 7,000 years BC contain charred hazelnut shells, indicating a massive harvest. These findings prove that people relied on walnut trees long before the existence of agriculture, creating entire settlements around walnut groves. Historically, hazelnuts were the most important food source in Europe. During food crises and famines, hazelnuts provided critical calories and fat when crops failed. Nuts were collected from both wild and cultivated trees, since they ripened regardless of weather conditions that destroyed grain fields. Medieval chronicles record how communities survived solely on nut supplies during sieges of cities. The monks of the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris in the year 1209 recorded that their walnut groves saved the monastery from death by starvation when a crop failure destroyed all grain reserves. The secret to hazelnuts is that most varieties require cross-pollination, meaning you need to plant at least 2 different varieties to produce good nuts. But once rooted, they bear fruit reliably for 40 to 50 years with minimal care. Figs are repeatedly mentioned in ancient texts and historical records as a symbol of prosperity and food security. There is a good reason for this reverence. Figs were one of the first domesticated crops around 9,400 BC in the Jordan Valley, according to research published in the journal Science. Fig trees are incredibly productive and adapted to harsh conditions. A mature tree can produce between 50 and 100 kilograms of fruit per year, with some larger trees producing significantly more. The fruits are sweet, nutritious, and can be eaten fresh or dried for long-term storage. Dried figs have been a staple food in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures for thousands of years. Imagine an ancient farmer protecting his fig tree during a drought, knowing it meant the difference between life and death for his family. The trees continued to bear fruit when grain stores were depleted or destroyed. Figs tolerate heat and drought exceptionally well. They grow in poor, rocky soils where other fruit trees have difficulty surviving. Once established, they require little maintenance and begin to bear fruit quickly, often within 2 to 3 years after planting. The survival value of figs lies in the dried fruit. Fresh figs are delicious but perishable, while dried figs last for over a year and are calorie-dense at approximately 1,200 calories per kilogram. It is rich in fiber, potassium, calcium, and natural sugars that provide quick energy. During sieges and famines in Mediterranean history, fig trees often meant the difference between survival and starvation. Trees continued to produce fruit when grain supplies were depleted or destroyed. When trade routes were blocked, the people with the fig trees had food while others starved. In 1453, the inhabitants of Constantinople survived on dried figs during the Ottoman siege when grain supplies were completely cut off. Chronicles show that families who owned fig trees in their gardens lasted months longer than those who depended only on imported grain. Figs are also easily propagated by cuttings, which means growing one tree into many trees. This made it possible to quickly expand food production without the need to buy new trees. One branch, properly rooted after 5 years, became a source of hundreds of kilograms of food annually. Apples are so common that people underestimate their survival value. A productive apple tree can produce from 90 to 180 kilograms of fruit per year after ripening. That's a lot of food from one tree, but the real value of apples is their storage and versatility. Apples stored in cool conditions remain fresh for 3 to 6 months. Dried apples can be stored for more than a year. Apple cider can be fermented and stored indefinitely. Before the advent of modern canning, apples were one of the few fruits that provided nutrition in the winter. Historically, apple orchards were essential to food security in temperate climates. During the American colonial period, every estate had an apple orchard because apples were reliable, productive, and shelf-stable. John Chapman, known as Johnny Appleseed, understood the connection between orchards and frontier survival. When crops died, apples provided carbohydrates and vitamin C to prevent scurvy. The documented practice of cider production served as a staple drink due to unsafe water sources, making apples more valuable as alcohol than as fruit. Apple trees also tolerate cold better than most fruit trees, making them viable in northern climates where peaches, citrus, and figs would not survive. The disadvantage is time. Apple trees take 6 to 10 years to reach full production. Most varieties require cross-pollination from another apple tree variety to produce good fruit. But once established, an apple tree will produce fruit for 50 to 80 years if properly cared for. Pomological records from the 18th century show that colonists cultivated more than 200 varieties of apples, each adapted to specific climates and uses. A family with 4 mature apple trees, each producing 90 kilograms, receives 360 kilograms of apples annually. This is enough for fresh consumption, drying for storage, making cider, and trading surplus. This is food security from trees that you plant once and harvest for decades. During the Great Depression, families with apple orchards had both food to consume and goods to sell. Trees continued to produce regardless of economic conditions, providing stability when banks and businesses failed. Carob is a plant that no one in temperate climates knows about, which is a shame because it is one of the most sustainable food trees on the planet. Carob trees produce pods that taste amazingly like chocolate. The pods are naturally sweet and can be eaten raw, ground into powder as a cocoa substitute, or processed into syrup. A mature carob tree produces between 90 and 180 kilograms of pods per year. But what makes the carob tree exceptional for survival is that it thrives in conditions that would kill most fruit trees: extreme drought, poor rocky soils, intense heat. The carob tree is native to the Mediterranean and has been cultivated for over 4,000 years precisely because it produces food in marginal conditions where other crops perish. During World War II, carob pods replaced unaffordable chocolate throughout Europe, saving children from having no sweets at all. Carob pods can be stored for years without being processed. Just pick them, dry them, and store them in a cool, dry place. They'll easily last 2 to 3 years. The pods contain approximately 50% sugar by weight, plus fiber and minerals, making them an emergency food during sieges and famines in Mediterranean history. The pods were also used as a measure of weight. The word carat for measuring gemstones comes from the seeds of the carob tree, which are remarkably uniform in weight. This speaks volumes about how valuable and widespread carob was historically. The ancient Egyptians included carob pods in their diet, and Roman traders transported them throughout the empire. Carob trees are slow to establish. They take 6 to 8 years to begin bearing fruit, but once mature they produce fruit for 80 to 100 years with little to no maintenance. No pruning, no fertilizing, no pest control. They simply grow in harsh conditions and produce hundreds of kilograms of sweet food to store every year. The limitation is climate. Carob requires a Mediterranean or subtropical climate with mild, wet winters and hot, dry summers. It is not frost-resistant below -7 degrees Celsius. But if you're in the right climate zone and planning for long-term food security in a warming, drying world, carob is one of your best bets. In 10 years, you'll be collecting hundreds of kilograms of sweet pods that last indefinitely and taste like chocolate. Not a bad investment for a tree that will outlive you by half a century. Before the chestnut blight of the early 1900s devastated American chestnut populations, chestnuts were one of the most important food trees in temperate climates. In some parts of Europe and Asia, they still remain so. A mature chestnut tree can produce between 90 and 180 kilograms of nuts per year. These are not small nuts. Chestnuts are large, starchy, and filling. They contain approximately 200 calories per 100 grams, making them more calorie-dense than potatoes by weight. Chestnuts are unique among nuts in that they are low in fat and high in carbohydrates, making them nutritionally more similar to a grain than a nut. Historical records from the USDA indicate that American chestnut trees once made up 25% of the eastern forests of the United States. Imagine forests dropping billions of nuts every year. That was free food scattered across the continent every autumn. Chestnuts can be roasted, boiled, ground into flour for baking, or dried for storage. In parts of Italy and France, chestnut flour has been a staple food for centuries. Mountain communities were completely dependent on chestnut forest when lowland crops failed. The catch is timing. Chestnut trees take 5 to 7 years to begin bearing fruit and 20 to 30 years to reach peak production. You plant not for yourself, but for your children and grandchildren. But these trees are massive and durable, capable of living for more than 300 years and reaching enormous sizes. During the European famine, chestnut forests supported mountain communities. As lowland crops died, trees grew on slopes and marginal lands unsuitable for farming. They required no maintenance, just kept producing year after year for centuries. One tree could produce enough nuts to feed 7 for months. The fungus Cryphonectria parasitica was introduced in New York in 1944, and over the course of decades, it destroyed entire ecosystems. Imagine how the forests that fed people and animals for thousands of years collapsed. It was an environmental disaster equivalent to the loss of a staple grain crop. American chestnuts were almost completely destroyed by the disease, but disease-resistant varieties were developed. Chinese and European chestnuts are also available and resistant to the disease. Choose varieties suited to your climate and protect them from deer while establishing. Nut trees are dual-purpose. They produce food and valuable wood. A mature walnut tree produces from 25 to 40 kilograms of nuts per year. This is from 150,000 to 240,000 calories from one tree. Walnuts last for over a year in their shells and are one of the best plant-based sources of healthy fats. Walnuts are nutritionally dense, rich in omega-3 fatty acids, protein, and calories. During food crises, fats are often the hardest to find nutrients to obtain. Walnut trees solve this problem by producing high-quality fats for decades on end. Black walnut trees are native to North America and are incredibly hardy. They tolerate poor soils, drought, and cold winters. They are also allelopathic, producing a chemical called juglone that inhibits the growth of some other plants nearby. This means careful planning of where to plant, but it also means less competition. English nuts, also called Persian nuts, are less hardy but produce larger, thin-shelled nuts that are easier to crack. During the Great Depression, families with walnut trees had nuts to eat and sell when other sources of income disappeared. Walnut trees take 6 to 10 years to begin bearing fruit and 20 to 30 years to reach full production. But they live from 150 to 200 years, which means planting a legacy. A mature walnut tree can cost thousands of dollars in wood alone, but annual nut production provides continued value. Historically, walnut trees were planted along property lines and along roadways because they eventually became valuable timber. Producing food was a bonus to long-term economic value. The trees required no maintenance, simply producing nuts and increasing the value of the wood at the same time. During World War II, nut trees provided critical fats when meat and butter were rationed. Families with their own trees had nutritious fats that were not available through the distribution system. Government programs even encouraged the planting of walnut trees as a strategic resource. Plant pecan trees away from orchards due to jug loan, water while establishing protect from deer and squirrels, then wait. In 10 years, you will begin to harvest. In 30 years, you will collect kilograms of nuts annually. In 100 years, the tree will still bear fruit, and if necessary, you can sell the wood for serious money. Oak trees fed entire civilizations. Acorns have been a staple food for indigenous peoples of North America, Europe, and Asia for thousands of years. A mature oak tree can produce 200 to 500 kilograms of acorns per year. This is not a typo. Hundreds of kilograms of food from one tree every year for 300 years. Acorns contain approximately 2,000 calories per kilogram, carbohydrates and protein. When properly processed, they are nutritious and satisfying. The catch is that most acorns contain tannins, which make them bitter and difficult to digest. They require leaching, soaking in water repeatedly to remove tannins before consumption. But some oak species, especially white oak varieties, produce sweet, low-tannin acorns that require minimal processing. Korean, Japanese, and some white oaks produce acorns that can be eaten with little or no leaching. California Indian tribes managed oak groves as food production systems. The Miwok and Yokuts tribes cleared underbrush, protected trees, and collected acorns as a primary food source. Acorns were not a supplementary food, they were the mainstay of their diet for thousands of years. Acorn flour was ground and used to make bread, porridge, and other staple dishes. Ethnographic records show that one family could collect and process up to 1,000 kilograms of acorns per season, providing the carbohydrate basis for the entire year. During famines in Europe and Asia, acorns were an emergency food that saved lives. During the Korean War, acorns became a significant food source when other supplies were unavailable. People who knew processing technologies survived where others starved. The long-term value of oak trees for food security is unparalleled. You plant an oak tree today, 20 years later it starts producing acorns. 50 years later it produces hundreds of kilograms a year. 200 years later it is still bearing fruit. Your great-great-grandchildren will collect acorns from the tree you plant. Oak trees also support ecosystems. They provide habitat for wildlife, improve soil, and create microclimates. They are drought-tolerant once established and require zero maintenance. Choose oak species with sweet acorns if possible. White oak, Oregon white oak, or Asian species like sawtooth oak. Every year that the planting of these trees is delayed is a year of production lost. An apple tree planted today will bear fruit in 6 to 10 years. An apple tree planted in 10 years will bear fruit in 16 to 20 years. The mathematics is simple and merciless. The best time to plant these trees was 20 years ago, when you didn't know you'd need them. The second best time is today, before you need them. Imagine yourself 15 years from now standing in front of an empty lot and realizing that a tree planted today would already feed your family. Annual vegetable gardens provide immediate gratification. Plant in the spring, harvest in the fall, eat what you grow. Trees are delayed gratification. Plant today and harvest in a decade. But this harvest continues for decades or centuries after. Think about it. If your grandparents planted an oak tree when they were young, you could be harvesting hundreds of pounds of acorns right now. If you plant an oak tree today, your grandchildren will have the same opportunity. Each year of delay pushes this opportunity 1 year further for your descendants. Behavioral psychology explains why people don't plant trees. Discounting the future causes us to underestimate long-term benefits relative to immediate needs. We see empty space in the garden and think about vegetables for this year rather than fruits in a decade. Research shows that people psychologically discount the value of future benefits by about 30% for every year they wait. This means that we perceive a tree that will produce a crop 10 years from now as having only a tiny fraction of the value of today's vegetable crop. Imagine a farmer who looks at his plot every spring and thinks, "I need food this fall." He plants tomatoes, carrots, cabbage, crops that will solve the problem in 6 months. There is an apple tree sapling nearby, but the farmer passes by it year after year because the apple tree will not solve this year's problem. 20 years later, the same farmer is still planting annual crops every spring. If he had planted the apple tree in the first year, he would now be able to harvest 100 kilograms of apples every year without any effort. But the psychology of short-term thinking deprived him of this abundance forever. The real strategy is multi-level food security. You don't choose between annual crops and trees, you plant both. Annual crops feed you this year and next. Trees feed you after 10, 30, 100 years. Area planning principles from permaculture show that a complete food security system includes annual vegetables for immediate production, perennial crops like berries and asparagus for medium-term production, and fruit and nut trees for long-term production. When you have all 3 levels, you are never dependent on one timeline. If annual crops die, you have perennials. If you are unable to plant this year, the trees will continue to bear fruit regardless of what you do. If the economy collapses, your food system runs on its own. The families that survived hunger and food crises best were those who had a variety of food sources over different time frames. They had grain stores from last year, crops growing this year, and trees planted decades earlier that were still producing fruit without human intervention. If you can only plant a few trees, prioritize based on your climate and time frame. USDA hardiness zone maps and climate change projections show shifting growing zones, adding urgency to making the right choices now. Cold climate, apple trees, hazelnuts, walnuts. These trees can withstand temperatures down to minus 30 degrees and produce high-calorie food critical to survival in harsh winters. Apple trees provide vitamin C to prevent scurvy when fresh vegetables are not available for months. Temperate climate. Add figs, mulberries, chestnuts. These trees extend your fruiting season and add a variety of nutrients. Figs bear fruit twice a year in many temperate zones, doubling production per tree. Warm Mediterranean climate. Focus on figs, mulberries, carob, and explore citrus or other subtropical options. Carob thrives in conditions that are becoming too dry for traditional fruit trees, making it a strategic choice for a warming world. If you want quick production, mulberries and figs bear fruit in 2 to 4 years. Mulberries begin to produce berries in the 3rd year. Figs often bear fruit already in the 2nd year after planting. This is the closest thing to immediate gratification you can get from trees. If you're planning long-term, chestnuts, walnuts, and oaks have been producing for centuries. An oak tree planted today will feed your descendants 300 years from now. The chestnut reaches peak production after 30 years and continues to bear fruit for another 200 years after that. If you want maximum calories, oaks, chestnuts, walnuts. A single mature oak tree produces more than 1 million calories annually, enough to provide half the caloric needs of an adult. Chestnut provides a carbohydrate base equivalent to that of a grain crop. If you want drought-resistant food to store, carob can't be beat. Its pods last 3 years without being processed and are produced under conditions that kill other crops. If you want maximum nutritional diversity, plant a mixture of fruit and nut trees to provide both carbohydrates, fats, and vitamins. A universal rule is to plant more than you think you need. Trees die, crops vary, animals eat fruit, weather damages trees. It is better to overplant now and thin out later if necessary than to be left without sufficient production a decade from now. Ecological resilience theory confirms that diverse systems survive crises better than monocultures. A family with 6 different types of fruit trees will survive a disease that wipes out one species. Climate changes that damage apple trees may not affect carob. Imagine a crop failure scenario mitigated by diversity. A late frost kills the apple blossoms, but the figs bloom later and escape damage. Drought reduces production of most fruits, but carob thrives in dry conditions. Pests attack walnut trees, but the mulberry remains untouched. Historical records show that families with a dozen different fruit trees rarely suffered a complete crop failure. Something was always producing food, even in the worst years. Monoculture orchards, apple trees or citrus only, risked complete loss of harvest from one problem. Annual crops are agriculture. Trees are heritage. When you plant a walnut tree today, you're not only feeding yourself 10 years from now, you feed your children 30 years from now, your grandchildren 60 years from now, creating food security that extends beyond your lifetime. Research on generational wealth shows that land assets and permanent crops are inherited more often than any other form of property. The tree becomes a family asset that grows in value and productivity for decades after your death. Imagine the story of a grandfather and grandson. An old man plants an oak tree, knowing that he will never see it fully bear fruit. 60 years later, his grandson stands under massive branches, collecting hundreds of kilograms of acorns, thanks to the foresight of a man he barely remembers. This is a power that annual vegetable gardens cannot have. The civilizations that flourished for centuries were the ones that planted trees. The families that survived multi-generational hardships were those that had gardens and walnut groves planted by their ancestors. You can become such an ancestor for your descendants. You can plant trees that will provide food for your descendants decades after you are gone. Or you can continue to plant annual crops and hope that next year's harvest will be sufficient. The choice is yours, but the best time to choose was 20 years ago. History shows the cost of delay. The dust storms of the 1930s destroyed millions of hectares of monoculture farming in a few years. Families with diverse perennial systems survived a catastrophe that devastated entire regions that depended solely on annual crops. Imagine 2 future scenarios 30 years from now. In the first, you prepare your garden beds every spring at the age of 70, hoping for a good harvest. In the second, you collect hundreds of kilograms of nuts and fruits from the trees you planted in your youth, while your neighbors are struggling with crop failure. The second best time is today. Tomorrow will become yesterday, the day you missed. In 10 years, you will regret every day of delay. In 20 years, the difference between action today and action tomorrow will be measured in tons of food and decades of safety.